Okay, so we are going to look at the topic here is what is the topic? What is hermeneutics about? That's what it was called, the title. Thus far, we have looked at literary theory using Eagleton's little guide, which is used in undergrad classes to explain what the project of literary theory is. And there's some overlap here in terms of thinkers, but hermeneutics is dealing with slightly different questions, and they do influence one another. So let me say, the most important figure we're going to read about today or talk about today is Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger, who's a philosopher, German philosopher, and arguably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, is the most important and influential thinker for the post-structuralist critics. So those that are coming in the 1960s in France and elsewhere. And the post-structuralist writers will then be influential on the various types of identity group theories. So Latino studies and queer studies and so forth. Those will come out of the post-structuralist movement. So we're coming at hermeneutics in part because it is discussing the playing field that Heidegger's involved in. So that's the rationale for it. And Heidegger is not a literary critic. It's just that his thought relates to writing, and it's profoundly influential and necessary to know in order to understand the later critics. And so that's why we're bringing him in here. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit when we, so Heidegger is writing 30s, 40s, and 50s and onwards. We are going to backtrack a little bit to look at Ferdinand de Saussure and his structuralist linguistics in a couple of classes. So that'll be actually going backwards a little bit. But I wanted to bring in hermeneutics at this stage just to try and give a broad picture of the scope, and then to come back to what I think is a less important but still influential writer in, as I say, Saussure. And modern linguistics, at least on the continent. By the way, we have a linguistics department. They don't follow the same school of linguistics as is used there. So it's more of an analytic. And basically, I think this is also true. There's a continental tradition of philosophy. There's a continental tradition of thought that is more or less coherent. And they read their own writers and they engage with that. And then there is the analytic school of philosophy, but it's also there in linguistics. And so there's often two schools operating in our day, and they don't even dialogue. There's no dialogue between them, other than to snipe at one another and so forth. But they don't really read the same texts or engage with it. This is from the continental tradition, Heidegger. So let me begin by what he cites here at the outset. I'm not going to use the quotation from Heraclitus. But what he argues or asks, and this is Gerald Brun's Hermeneutics, Ancient and Modern again, and the introduction to it. Let me try to situate my book by taking up in fairly familiar ways the question of what sort of thing hermeneutics might be and what its point is. And the simplest answer is that hermeneutics is a tradition of thinking or of philosophical reflection that tries to clarify the concept of verstehen, that is understanding. So this is the German word, to understand. What is it to make sense of anything? Whether it's a poem, a legal text, a human action, a language, an alien culture, or oneself. So on this point, I think hermeneutics is a vital thing. You will know hermeneutics from your studies in religious studies, the Bible. You would have done hermeneutics there, right? Which is how do we, my understanding from speaking to my colleague, more or less, he looks at the different varieties and genres of texts that are located in Scripture and then says, how are we to read and understand this text, let's say a Pauline epistle, as opposed to a passage of narrative. We have to read it differently. We have to understand that it has a certain genre and certain features. That's what's meant there by hermeneutics. This is a broader question. This is more philosophical hermeneutics. What are the core assumptions, the presuppositions by which we understand anything? How is it possible to even understand? Which is not in your class in hermeneutics, right? It's not asking those big, broad questions. So this is philosophical hermeneutics that we're talking about here. But it's not that it remains abstract, although it sounds like that, because then it gets applied into every field where there is a text, and that includes the fields of jurisprudence. So the law right now is informed by the things we're going to discuss today. So there are various views on how to read legal texts, or even what a law is and how we understand the law, and he's going to get to that in a minute. But basically, if I could, and overstating it somewhat, there are two schools of reading right now in the law. One is the originalist view, which has been popular south of the border, or at least it's advocated by conservatives, as they're called, which is that we read the original document in the spirit in which it was intended, and we stick to the letter of the law, more or less, or the letter of the document, and we don't move away from it. That's the traditionalist, or to some degree, we could call it the originalist view of hermeneutics. We're trying to recover that. It's the close reading that I talked about last class. It's more or less the methodology of Levis, and it's the methodology of the new critics. And we will read that book on At War with the Word, and he will engage with the new critics there. And I hope you've managed to open it already, but that's what he's talking about. And then on the other hand, there is what has been in the legal field, but it's not in literature, called the living tree school of reading, which is that a legal document, like all documents, is a living document, and it can be interpreted to mean things that aren't even stated in the original. So it's the spirit of the text rather than the words of the text. So what was intended by its original authors is it makes claims on things that were never even considered there, but it's in the same spirit. So just to give illustrations, the living tree, and this model of reading texts is the one that our own Supreme Court uses in Canada. It's regularly cited, and all the law schools in Canada tend to follow it. So if you don't think that this is practical, it really is. So do we read the words or do we read the spirit? Because there's the dividing line to some degree. It's the spirit that's intended by these words, and that spirit will be informed by our spirits and our words and so forth. And the living tree will say, therefore, it will make obvious progress or movement away from the original intent. I won't say for good, for ill, I'll just say that's the basic delineation there. Although I'll give an illustration in, I don't even know the year, but say 2005 or 6, Trinity Western was sued by I think the teachers union out west about their education school because of their statement of faith and their lifestyle policy on the issue of gay marriage, right, which became permitted legal in 2005, I think. And Trinity Western was at odds with that, and so it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that they were allowed to have a differing view on this because of religious freedom and so forth, right? So that's back then, and it's not that long ago. It's not even 15 years ago. The same case, more or less, was tried just 2 years ago about a law school at Trinity Western. It was the exact same issue as far as I was concerned. It came again to the Supreme Court. And so I knew what was going to happen, because the Supreme Court, if it agrees to hear a case upon which it's already decided, it usually dismisses it. And we're not going to go there again, because we've already decided on that. But they did do it, and as soon as they did do it, I knew that it was to produce a different verdict, or to consider the possibility of a different verdict at any rate. And that would be in accordance with the living tree understanding. And that's exactly what happened. And so they turned down the law school application. So that's just to illustrate what I'm talking about. And that's not a long period of time. So same basic issues. That was considered an issue of religious freedom. That remained as valid an objection or concern as it was before when the Supreme Court justices ruled on it. and ruled quite strongly. I think it was 6-1, but I can't remember the numbers. And then it was overturned, and almost the same sort of numbers against. I think it was 5-2 though. And it said, no, you can't do that. And now it's not an issue of religious freedom, it's about inclusion and so forth, right? So very big change. And you think, but hold on, you're not only making a comment on the law, you're making a comment on the status of the law and the judgment made by some of your own members, like the standing law. In Latin, it's called stare decisis. The standing law, the decision made by the Supreme Court, was considered immaterial to the judgment there. So that's just to illustrate. How is that even possible? Well, the spirit of the times has moved on, so we can move away from the words of judgment. So that's a neat way of seeing the distinction there. So when he asks here, what is it to make sense of anything, a poem, a legal text, a human action, a language, an alien culture, or oneself, the difficulty, he says, is that this is not an entirely coherent question. Or rather, the question of understanding turns up in many different contexts and has an application in many intellectual disciplines, some of which are hardly intelligible to one another. So there is the problem about how to frame the question. And I think that's part of the issue. How do we frame the question? What's the question we ask? And a lawyer will tell you, even depending on the question you ask, and certainly a debater will, the way you look at it to begin with will determine how you look at it outside that. And I illustrated that with the Eagleton lecture, or rather, it was the Eagleton lecture. I said because he frames English literature in the context of the 18th century, he comes up with a certain answer. Because that's in the Enlightenment. It's the paradigm of the age of reason, getting rid of tradition. So of course he comes up with a certain answer. And so it frames the narrative. So he introduces that. Now, one of the things that he observes here at the outset, and I think is helpful, is on page 2, he says, like what most conceptual histories that we are likely to write, when I say conceptual histories, histories of terms, concepts, which now moves away from etymology. Now, I want you to note this as well. In the Tolkien-Lewis school of English literature, they wanted the English literature to be rooted in the language. And when we say the language, in the Anglo-Saxon language, and see it developing out of that in the same way that Greek and Latin was to be understood as an outworking of that language. So establishing its credibility on the basis of a competence that was undeniable. So either you know the language or you don't. Right? It's very clinical, it's very objective. Whereas the modern school that was against them didn't want to be rooted in the words like that. They wanted to be unmoored from the words. They're more interested in the spirit, the development of things. And these were the progressives. So there was a little war going on there. But he says, like most conceptual histories, the histories of concepts, they're not going to go to the roots of things, which are thought to be grounding what comes afterwards. They're just simply going to talk about the change in the use of terms over time. We will come to, and I hope, if I have the time, to the writer at the end of that who makes heavy weather of this, Michel Foucault, because he talks about an archaeology of knowledge. It's one of his most important books, actually. It's called An Archaeology of Knowledge, and he gives us a history of concepts, but he doesn't talk about the root meaning of things. It's irrelevant. He's more interested in the spiritual dynamic and the power dynamic furthermore. But he says, back to this, like most conceptual histories that we are likely to write, this one of structured consciousness is dominated by a Copernican revolution. This phrase just keeps on coming up. It is used first by Copernicus, I guess, or people talking about Copernicus. So it's in astronomy. If you're in my Lewis class, we just talked about the shift from Ptolemaic geocentric cosmology to a Copernican heliocentric, so the sun at the center of the cosmos. And that's the original Copernican shift, right? Totally different view of astronomy, and with it, other things move along with it. to the second one, which is Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant, and we looked at him ever so briefly last semester, more in his work on aesthetics, or his critique of judgment at any rate, or the power of judgment. He, in his critique of pure reason, says that he wants to consider, to solve the challenge of the empiricists and establishing knowledge, rather than trying to think of the world outside of us being objective, and to the problem being our capacity to make objective, verifiable judgments about those things outside of us, let's maybe flip it around, just like Copernicus did, and think rather whether objects conform to our capacity to perceive it. So it's our capacity to perceive it which is the ground of objectivity, and not the status of the world outside of us, which is objective. So it flips, so that's the subjective turn towards the subject. That's the second Copernican turn. And now it's used metaphorically by Kant. The third one is the one we're talking about today, and it's related to hermeneutics. And this is Martin Heidegger's turn, and is the ontological turn, or sometimes called the linguistic turn. And probably the latter is a better description here. To look at how language forms, prejudges, determines how we conceive reality. Not just the mind, but language. Because Heidegger is concerned about the problems of a Kantian noumenal universe. By noumenal, this word, Greek word nous in there, noumenal. The idea of the intellect, or the mind, which I think Kant in some ways is very much following Descartes. They're both rationalists. So in the modern philosophy, there are two schools, basically speaking. There are the rationalists and the empiricists. And Kant we can see as following in Descartes' school of rationalism. Whereas the empiricists will follow more or less Aristotle and say that there's nothing that exists in our intellects that doesn't first exist in our senses. So the objective world, right? So before we have a concept of a thing or an understanding of things, we first have to perceive it through our senses, our five senses. That's Aristotle, actually. But the empirical school, David Hume and John Locke and so forth, these are all empiricist philosophers. You can speak to the philosophy department about this. They're far better versed in explaining and getting to the inside of that. But that's more or less the distinction there. And Heidegger is responding to the problems of the rationalists, I think. And the basic problem of rationalism is that it leads to an idea of the world that the physical world around us no longer seems to exist. A sort of Gnosticism arises out of it, in other words. So the real thing are my thoughts. To use Descartes' phrase, the res cogitans, the thinking substance, which is his mind. Calls it a race, a thing, but that is the thing. And remember, that's the only thing about which he's absolutely certain, the fact that he's thinking. And from the fact that he's thinking, he says that he can think of a being who's far greater than he is, and so forth, and that's God. But he grounds the intellect not on being like Aquinas did. He grounds it on thinking, on this noumenal thing, this non-substantial, non-physical, immaterial object. And Heidegger, it seems to me, and this is my comment on it just to help you try and understand what's going on here, I think that hermeneutics is a project of recovering the problems bequeathed by Descartes and Kant. And the problem is this: they talk about two faculties of understanding. There's the reason, and then there's the understanding, and they are in this order for Kant. The reason is so powerful that it totally wipes out the understanding. There's nothing left upon which we can really understand. There's no physical world left. No firm places to move on from. And I say that because in my other class on Lewis, he writes this really interesting passage, and I'm not going to get into it here because it'll take us too far away from this subject, but he notes in The Discarded Image, when he's talking about the rational soul, he says that there are two faculties of the rational soul in the medieval mindset, and those are the intellectus and the ratio. And intellectus is the word by which we translate understanding normally. And reason is the ratio. But they invert it, and they think the higher faculty is the understanding. It's what we share with the angels. They are the intellects. We are intellects. And ratio is a faculty that does certain things, but understanding is this established solid basis on which we can make those judgments. With Kant, it gets rid of the legitimacy of understanding, and certainly the priority of understanding things before we can even reason. It's pure reason, to use Kant's own word. It's a critique of pure reason. It's pure. What's it purified? It's purified of this thing, understanding. Let's start with that. It's a tabula rasa, as it were. And let me read you what, I'll just repeat what Lewis writes here, and I think it'll be helpful. Intellectus, understanding, is the higher, so that if we call it understanding, the Coleridgean distinction, which puts reason above understanding, Coleridge is following Kant, inverts the traditional order. Boethius, it will be remembered, distinguishes intelligentia from ratio. The former, the intelligence, being enjoyed in its perfection by angels. Intellectus is that in man which approximates most nearly to angelic intelligentia. It is, in fact, an umbrata intelligentia, a clouded intelligence or a shadow of intelligence. So the human faculty of understanding is something like angelic knowledge. Its relation to reason is thus described by Aquinas. Intellect, or intelligere, is the simple, that is simple as a philosophical definition, that is indivisible, uncompounded grasp of an intelligible truth. Whereas reasoning, ratiocinare, is the progression towards an intelligible truth by going from one understood, that is intellecto, point to another. And so here's the summary. The difference between them, intelligence and reason, is thus like the difference between rest on one hand and motion on the other, or possession on one hand and acquisition on the other. So the understanding is something that are fixed points upon which we can rest, upon which we can make judgments. So they're prior judgments, which we need in order to think at all. And I would say things like the laws of logic are such things. As Aristotle describes them, the three laws of logic, these are things of understanding. We need to understand and accept them in order to use our reasoning. If you don't accept the laws of logic, you cannot reason. There's no fixed point there anymore. I'm saying this and using this specific example because this is exactly what's going to come into question in the hermeneutics of the 20th century. They're going to dispute that there is such a thing as understanding or fixed points that will be cross-cultural. Right? But those are the distinctions. So it's the difference between rest, that is something we can be certain about, and motion, something we're moving on the basis of, or possession and acquisition. So there's no intellectual possessions anymore. Remember Kant, go back to the what is enlightenment last semester, I cited it. He says that enlightenment is the emancipation from the self-imposed tutelage to the ideas of the past. So it's the liberation from understanding. There's nothing that we are going to accept as already declared and understood and solid. We will look at everything. And he's following the Royal Society's motto, nullius in verba. Nothing in words, or a better, less literal translation, take no one's word for it. Use your reasoning. There is no point of common understanding. Use your reasoning. So reasoning has this capacity that so wipes the slate clean that hermeneutics is trying to recover the problems bequeathed by it. Hermeneutics is coming out of the continentalist tradition. So it's fixing the problems caused by Descartes and Kant. That's my take on it. I think I'm correct, but you can see for yourself in a minute. But that's what they're seeking to do. Now there are two types or two branches of hermeneutics, and he cites them here on page 2 and 3. There's transcendental hermeneutics, and that's connected with a figure by the name of Edmund Husserl, who is actually Martin Heidegger's Doktorvater, his doctor father, his supervisor. And then there's Heidegger himself. I'm going to skip over Husserl. Not that he's not important, but he's not important for the purposes of literary theory, at least as I'm going to depict it, because I've got so much on my plate already. I can't go down any more alleys than I already do. Let me come straight to Heidegger, although I think Husserl is actually quite profound, and he is foundational for Heidegger, but I'm just going to move forward because again, space of time. Opposed to transcendental hermeneutics, so this is on page 3, at least at first glance, is Heidegger's analysis of understanding as a mode of practical involvement or concern with others and with the world. So understanding is of forms of life. Now that phrase there, forms of life, is directly pointing to his mentor's Husserl's Lebenswelt, life world. So the forms of life comes out from the lived world, the world in which we live. And it's saying that living actually has an influence. It frames how we understand things. So being in this world, to use, and it's Heidegger's own phrase, being in this world predisposes us towards understanding things in a certain way, the terms and conditions of space and time, and culture and country, and most of all of language, predisposes us to understand things in a certain way. So that's the prejudice that the rationalists wiped out by just pure reason. So I go back to what the summary here. Understanding is of forms of life and also internal to them. It entails being able to speak the language spoken by those around you and taking as natural or intelligible, that is not needing explanation, the ways of acting, thinking, and feeling that are local and current. Now, if you want to think about this, when we speak a language, there's a lot of stuff that we have to take for granted about a person's ability to understand us. One is just they know the words, but there's a lot more to it than simply using words. There are problems of translation, of course, but even if they understood the terms, would they know what you meant by them? And so when you say to somebody in polite English, I would prefer if you didn't do that, would they register that as, I understood what he's saying that, but he didn't say no, so therefore I can do it? Or would they say, oh, this is somebody who's treating me with courtesy and is therefore expecting me to obey without question, but not wanting to command me to do it? If you weren't an English speaker and weren't brought up with that understanding, I would prefer you didn't do that, you might say, well, that's not an absolute prohibition, I'm going to do it anyway. And I would find you monstrously rude, but you would say, well, you're not being very clear. You should have just said no. Why didn't you say no? And I said, well, I did say no. I said, I'd prefer you didn't do it. And I think, but that's not clear. There's ambiguity there. And I think, yes, the ambiguity was to acknowledge that you have a freedom, and I didn't want to compel you because I'm not don't want to boss you and order you, because you're a human being that bears the image of God, and you have freedom, and I'm allowing you to do the right thing here and not acting as if you have no personal agency, right? But that's what I'm talking about. There's certain assumptions, cultural expectations, even apart from the language and the words themselves, right? And the language would be... So Heidegger's favorite example is knowing what a hammer is for. Like, a hammer is just a certain type of tool, but you have to know what a hammer is for to use a hammer properly. It's not for... Well, you could kill somebody with a hammer, of course, but you're supposed to know what a hammer... And hammers are his metaphors for words. Each word serves a certain... It's a tool. It serves a certain function. You're supposed to know what the tool is for in the context in which it's being used as well. All of those things are implied in using language, right? So it's quite, I think it's quite helpful in many ways. He's speaking about an aspect of language which reflects a lived experience, and it's part of being a human being is using words in this way, and understanding, well, what's the context, and what are the stated truths, and what are the implied things that the speaker is taking for granted. And when you come to translation, all of these things will play a role in it. And even if you're going back to our example of biblical languages, when you're reading an epistle or a narrative, what is the author assuming here that he's not even telling you need to know that. He's assuming that his audience does know that. And we don't live in that context, so maybe we're missing the point. And that's a part of a good understanding of a text is learning those implicit things there. But that's what he's talking about. So Heidegger, it's involved the knowing what a hammer is for. Now this is, as I say, ontological hermeneutics. Now knowing this, that is what a hammer is for, presupposes the sharing of a world made up of, among other possibilities, garages and hardware stores of houses being built, and tacks in the carpet. At this level, the way to understand understanding, that is verstehen, would not be through conceptual clarification and the construction of theories. So what's a hammer for? Well, let me talk about the word hammer and its etymological derivation. Where does the word hammer come from? Well, it's a Germanic word, actually. It's the same word, a hammer. Okay. That's not going to help me at what it's for, to use it. The Germans might use a hammer to hit people with. They have war hammers, right? And you know what the Germans are like. So anyway, it's slanderous, terrible to the Germans, whom I dearly love. But what's a hammer for? But we're not asking what the hammer means. We're not asking for a conceptual definition. We're asking for application. So the Lebenswelt. So at this level, the way to understand understanding would not be through conceptual clarification and the construction of theories. Rather, one can hardly not understand it, because it discloses itself most powerfully in its disruption, or when it withholds itself, as when we find ourselves in a strange land or suffer alienation or exclusion. That is, the reality of understanding seems to show itself most clearly in moments of epistemological crisis, or in the breakdown of everyday practice. And Franz Kafka's work Metamorphosis gives us a sort of cosmic nightmare version of what this might be like. So if you have you read the Metamorphosis by Kafka? Yeah. You have. I used to have it in my first year course. I dropped it for no particular reason. A man, Gregor Samsa, wakes up and he's a bug. He went to sleep and he woke up and he was a beetle. Okay. What happens then? Now, first of all, he doesn't realize that he is a beetle. It's other people's response to him. The fact that he's a beetle means he can't communicate and he can't speak. And there's a whole process of going on there. So the landlord is distressed that suddenly he's got a big, giant beetle in his house and he doesn't know what to do with him and he's misunderstood. All that sort of... Kafka's talking about modern alienation, how people who have lived in a culture are being alienated by the progress going on around them. That's what he's really talking about there. You will know it if you ever go to another country and try and live in that culture. The language is different, the habits are different, the expectations are different, All of those things. And some are more alienating than others. But here it's being used not as an intercultural thing. It's about human alienation from life via technology, and I think even more from what Lewis called the abolition of man. I think that's the real issue. And Heidegger writes a lot on technology and the effect of technology. It does give us power, and as Lewis said, it gives us power over nature, and it gives us power over human nature. Well, what is alienated in the process? Lewis described it as the chest as being one thing, but it's not only the chest. It's the whole physical natures. So now it's not just an epistemological crisis either, then it's a crisis of living. And I don't think there's any, I don't think it's accidental that the greatest atrocities against people in human history take place in the 20th century through technology. Because of the power of technology allows people's natural depravity to do things which they could never have done before. So the gas chambers and so forth, those are unthinkable in the past, but because they were literally unthinkable, because you couldn't do that. Would they have done that had they had the capacity to do that? I don't know. It's a question that can't be answered. But he's talking about this here. So understanding shows itself most clearly when everyday practice breaks down. That's when the need for understanding becomes apparent. And so the urgent necessity of understanding, of being able to live and apply language, that becomes the issue. And so hermeneutics becomes more and more important as technology gets applied to human nature. Then understanding what exactly it is and the relevance of the past to the present is effectively disregarded as relevant to our human nature. Now, I don't agree with this, of course, as you know. But that's the general cultural context there. So let me skip over that and move on to some of the other things. But I thought that was worth saying at the outset here. But to summarize or put it in a different way, and this is from Being and Time, page 192 and 93, the hermeneutical circle in this event is never purely philological. It's not just about understanding words or the meaning of words. That is, it is not simply an exegetical movement between the parts and the whole of the text. And you will know when you come to read a biblical text, people talk about the importance of exegesis, right? So that's the core thing that you do, at least in an evangelical college. You want to exegete the text properly, right? And then comes application. And then comes what we call eisegesis, so the reading into the text. But exegesis begins first. But he says the hermeneutical circle means that it's never only an exegetical exercise. And I, as an evangelical, I actually still agree. It's never, once you've done the hard work of exegesis, you've still got a lot of work left to do, which is the world of 21st century Canada is different than Israel in the time of Christ. It's a very different one. So how does this apply here? And what are we to understand as the core principle in bringing that application in? And I do agree that we are bound to some degree by the word, but others from a different vantage point and the living tree of understanding will go in a different direction and say actually the exegesis is almost irrelevant. Because what really matters is what the text means to us now. Anyway, but it's the point of hermeneutics, it's not simply an exegetical movement between the parts and the whole of a text that is present before us as an object. Instead, it is an ontological movement between the text and our situation as interpreters of it. So it's not just exegetical, it's ontological. So this is why Heidegger is called it's called the ontological turn, and not just the linguistic turn. It's both of those. Now you may say, where does this go? Now I want to spend time on this passage, which is seemingly irrelevant, but I think is really helpful in illustrating some of the implications of Heidegger's shift to the ontological turn and the linguistic turn. And this is in reference to a writer by the name of Peter Winch, who is drawing on Wittgenstein and company, and the essay is called Understanding a Primitive Society. It will be relevant to Canada because this is part of now the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? We're dealing often with native cultures, such as my own, of a pre-literate culture, or even not a literate culture. It's an oral tradition, as it were. How do we understand that? And because it's very popular now, in fact, is being demanded in academia and in government that we accept native modes of understanding, traditional modes of understanding, and forms of knowledge. Those are the exact words that are used, right? That's bearing directly on this. So, look at the essay, Understanding a Primitive Society. So, take this question. What would happen if you gave an account of a move in chess that would be unintelligible to chess players? Peter Winch applies a question of roughly this Wittgensteinian type to the problem that Western anthropologists face in giving accounts of alien cultures. The case in question is the Azande tribe, which is given to strange practices. They plant seeds and harvest the ensuing crops. That's not strange. But in addition, they perform magical rites of some sort, in the absence of which, or so they evidently believe, no crops will grow from the planted seeds. So they don't just plant the crops and sow and reap. They also perform a magical rite, and they say if they leave that magical rite out, the crops won't grow. The anthropologist, in this case E. Evans Pritchard, is in this position. He just knows better. That is, he can't help knowing that magical rites don't matter because they don't do them in Britain, right? And the crops grow, so therefore it's unnecessary, right? He's not being bigoted. It's just like, we don't do that in Britain. The crops grow all the same, so this is an unnecessary step that you're taking there. So under proper environmental conditions, seeds will grow into crops no matter what, or anyhow, without any mediation of magic and witchcraft. Okay, but what's Winch's point? His point is that if the anthropologist says, appealing to the superior knowledge, that the believers in magical rites are, well, irrational, the anthropologist is wrong. And not just wrong, but crucially wrong. According to Evans Pritchard, scientific notions are those which accord with objective reality. Well, Evans Pritchard comes from England, and that's his understanding of how science works. That's why we call it knowledge. It accords with objective reality, whereas the rites of the tribe understudy do not, because the crops can grow without the magic rite, so it's not knowledge. You can't call it knowledge. Against this, Winch argues that the concept of reality cannot be external to a language in which it makes sense to use that concept. And here's the quote: reality is not what gives language sense. What is real and what is unreal shows itself in the sense that language has. So it discloses itself in the language, and if you don't use the language, you're not going to understand it. And so there's no objectivity outside of language. As later writer Derrida will say, there is no outside the text. There is no reality outside of language. Or to use Heidegger's terms, and I'm going to review Heidegger later and give it in greater detail. His, not the German, I'll give you the English translation. Language is the house of being. There's no understanding of reality outside of language. Language is the very thing that allows us to understand. Verstehen, or intellect. The fixed points. Language is that fixed point. And it forms and predisposes us towards understanding it. So when the scientist or anthropologist Evans Pritchard says that scientific notions accord with objective reality, and the rights of the tribe don't fit there, so therefore they're not real. Evans Pritchard says, but reality is not what gives language sense. What is real and unreal shows itself in the sense that language has. But there are multiple languages, and it won't do to import into one language a concept of reality that has application only in another. And the same goes for the concept of rationality. As Winch puts it in a book called The Idea of Social Science and Its Relation to Philosophy, quote, criteria of logic are not a direct gift from God, but arise out of and are only intelligible in the context of ways of living or modes of social life. It follows that one cannot apply criteria of logic to modes of social life as such. For instance, science is one such mode, and religion is another, and each has criteria of intelligibility peculiar to itself. End quote. Now, my philosopher colleagues' heads are exploding at this point, right? Do you see the point that's being made, at least, on the side of Winch? If we accept that we have to know what a hammer's for, and there are certain expectations and understandings that you need to understand in order to operate within that culture, you can't do it from another language and with other ones. That's the point that he's trying to make. And there's no understanding of the world without the language. And language, so we're not in a position to judge, in other words, says Winch. So the judgment that these are irrational beings is true for Evans Pritchard, but it's not true for the Azande tribe, says Winch. This is the issue. Now, within all of that arises the cultural studies departments, with the basic sense rooted in Heidegger's understanding of language and how it disposes in a certain way, and that it's the house of being, and we can't speak of being on its own. Rather, being is housed within language, and it's characterized by language, and it's shaped by language. That's where we'll be able to say whether something is real or unreal. Now, there's an objection. The objection's made by Alasdair MacIntyre. You know who he is. He's a Catholic philosopher, important one at that. This is a line of thinking to which Alasdair MacIntyre objected, arguing that it's all very well to say that the criteria of logic are internal to forms of life. But this doesn't deprive us of the warrant to criticize Azande magic as being, among other things, bad science. And now quoting MacIntyre, it seems to me, MacIntyre said, that one could only hold the belief of the Azande rational in the absence of any practice of science and technology. In other words, if they didn't have any technological means and they didn't had no understanding at all, in that sense, it would be rational if there was nothing to contradict it. So if they were isolated on their own, the Azande would appear rational. If they never encountered another species of human beings, for them it would seem perfectly rational to do this, and it is in fact to them. But as soon as they encounter another group of human beings that say, but we don't need the magical right, it would have, at that point the magic would appear irrational and unscientific. That's MacIntyre's point. But only in the absence of the practice of science and technology. But to say this is to recognize the appropriateness of scientific criteria of judgment from our standpoint. And now the language of appropriateness. But appropriate to whom? That's Winch's reply. And he says that appropriateness is not obvious. Either that Azande witchcraft is simply a primitive form of science, or that we are further along in the history of rational criticism and inquiry than they are, and so are in a position to judge the coherence of their beliefs. Well, this gives rise to cultural relativism then. And what Winch says is Azande witchcraft belongs to a different sort of history and a different category of practice, one which Winch tries to characterize in terms of the expression of, quote, an attitude to contingencies, one which involves recognition that one's life is subject to contingencies rather than an attempt to control those. Okay, so now he's presenting it, interestingly, in terms that I'm sort of amenable to, and at the same time not. He's saying that witchcraft is not an attempt to control and dominate life, whereas modern science, post-Bacon, is exactly that. It's to try and control life. And characteristic of the Western intellectual world, post-scientific revolution, is precisely to do that, to exert power over nature, to dominate it. And later on, as Lewis says, to control even human nature. Whereas he says magic doesn't do that. It's not an attempt to control things. That's what Winch says. My retort to Winch is Lewis has just argued the exact opposite. And that magic arises in the 16th century and has the very same attempt to gain power over life. It's motivated by power. It's not it's not distinct from that. He doesn't understand how magic works even in the Western tradition. It is an attempt to gain power. And witchcraft is forbidden precisely for that reason in the Western tradition. So Winch doesn't understand his own tradition when he is giving a free pass to the Azande. The Azande just live in harmony with nature, and they're living with the land, but they're not oppressive, and they don't have any power motive and none of that sort of thing. Well, that's a bad understanding of what magic is. In fact, it's a reductive understanding of magic. It's somebody who doesn't believe that magic works. So they say certain things, and they really believe it, so it's okay for them, and we're not to judge. But actually, they're trying to exercise power as well. So that's my retort to him. Anyway, but he's not there, so I get to be right. And I'll live with that. So Winch understands magic as passive and reflective. It's saying something about the people. It's their cultural practice. It's their traditional understanding of things, and we need to acknowledge that. Because it's not oppressive, it lives in conjunction with nature, whatever. In other words, it's talking about the savages as noble savages, and they really mean well, whereas we don't. We're oppressors. We regard their practices as irrational, etc., etc. And I think all cultural values at that point become pointless. So if we go the Winch route and we say that we call this valuable and they call that valuable, and we can agree to disagree on value, then all value becomes transitory. It's valuable for me, that's valuable for you, but there's no such thing as value. But for Winch, and you can read the paragraph yourself, it's in the middle of 6, he talks about the importance in understanding of understanding and learning from an alien culture. That's the point of understanding. So rather than say of the Azande that their magic is irrational, let's try and understand on their terms what they mean by magic and why they use it, and then we will gain understanding. And that's the process of hermeneutics there, and living with one another. So it's inclusive, it's tolerant, and it is non-judgmental. Right? And that's the education is the key here. Now, does that sound familiar at all? We mustn't judge. As Bruns summarizes it, the point of trying to understand an alien form of life, that is one that isn't ours, is no longer descriptive and evaluative, rather it is now reflective and self-critical. So when we try to understand another culture, we no longer actually judge them, we judge ourselves. That's what happens. How has this worked out in academic practice? We acknowledge our power, privilege, etc. So when we encounter somebody who does something which appears to us irrational and bigoted, we don't actually say it's irrational and bigoted and prejudicial and injurious to humanity. We think, why is my immediate response to this practice to call it barbaric when really I should be criticizing why I'm criticizing. So it becomes a self-reflective thing. That's what Winch is proposing here. It becomes reflective. So all the criticism, all the objections, all the belief in the irrationality of the practice should be turned back upon me, and I should think when encountering something very different and alien, why do I regard this as repugnant? What is it about me that's wrong? Why do I call this irrational? What is it about me that leads me to that conclusion? And by acknowledging them, then the distinctions between the two get bridged to some degree, and then there's a harmony that arises out of it. I'm trying to give it a fair shake here rather than just simply tearing it apart, because I think it's untenable. And the reason why is because my prejudice to the things I object to is now not got rid of, it's simply applied to me. It's still a prejudice, but now it's a prejudice against myself. But the prejudice, I haven't got rid of the problem of prejudice. It's just now an anti-rational, anti-Western, anti-white male prejudice. But it's still a prejudice, and I would say at least as problematic, if not more so, if I actually believe there is such a thing as science and the laws of logic. Then it's just simply a self-destructive exercise. And I think that's hard to controvert that impression. Comments or thoughts there? Are you following me here? I'm leading you through the text a little bit here. As I say, we'll dig down and we'll talk more about Heidegger and give more fulsome explanation of where Heidegger is coming from here. But he's giving the broad overview of hermeneutics here, and I think it's helpful. One more thing he says, and this is Winch. What we may learn by studying other cultures are not merely possibilities of different ways of doing things, other techniques. More importantly, we may learn different possibilities of making sense of human life, different ideas about the possible importance that the carrying out of certain activities may take on for a man trying to contemplate the sense of his life as a whole. And Winch complains that MacIntyre can only see Azande magic as a misguided technique for producing consumer goods. But Azande's crops are not just potential artifacts of consumption. The life he lives, his relations with his fellows, his chances of acting decently or doing evil may all spring from his relation to his crops. Magical rites constitute a form of expression in which these possibilities and dangers may be contemplated and reflected on, and perhaps also thereby transformed and deepened, end quote, page 321 from that previously cited text. Okay, so what does this mean? I ought to accept magic as a form of self-expression and not be judgmental about it. It's a way of living. If you want to see why magic and the occult are rising in Western culture, it's precisely because of a tolerance for it. Indeed, not a tolerance, a willing embrace, and as a desire to be inclusive of magic and inclusive irrationality to show that we are making progress. So the old dividing lines, and those will then go further to relationships between people, between adults and children, between young and old, between different nations. So rather than thinking that the Western world is right and has reason and science and has made progress, we ought to rather consider the way in which we brought regress. And that will be the next realm of progress, is the self-denigration, or rather the privileging of cultures other than our own, and including what we would think of as primitive modes of life. It's to point out the pointlessness of our own life. That's what education then is. So I think you've got the sense there. I'm going to go on to express my reservations, concerns at a later date. I think they're probably already apparent. So that's from Winch's essay, Understanding of Primitive Society. And Bruns comments that and this is page 8, it does not belong to the conceptual history of hermeneutics. It is deeply involved with the subject of hermeneutics. That is, it's Sache. German word, lots of German here. I always find it troubling when English speakers cite a language that they themselves have not mastered. I mean, to some degree it is necessary, and there's no translation for it, and therefore you do it, but I'm a German translator, right? So it's not that I don't understand the words here, although academic German is a challenging thing, although this word's a basic word, Sache. It's that the more a critic uses foreign words in his own language, the more opaque it is to his readers, and the harder it is to follow and to make sense. And my question is that an accidental outcome, or is that an intentional one? And I think it's an intentional one. And I'm not saying it's the case here with Bruns, because I think Bruns does know what he's talking about. But just comment there. And you will find in literary theory there is a plethora of jargon, foreign words, etc. And I don't think that most of those that use the words even understand the words and what they actually mean. So, which is enough of a problem. But he says that it's not just it's the Sache, what hermeneutics is about. That's what this is really. It's not about the Azande tribe. It's really about what hermeneutics is all about. That's really the issue here. What sense this question will have for us is determined, says Bruns, by how we frame it. And there are multiple intersecting and conflicting frames. Hermeneutics, as I understand it, says Bruns, is this whole network of lines and angles on the question of verstehen. So verstehen, once again, is the German word for understanding, as opposed to reason. If you go back to what I said about the medieval understanding of the intellect, the verstehen is the fixed point. It's the point that allows us to live. It's the certainties. It's the things upon which we can stand, and then we can use our reason from those points. The problem with the rationalist perspective is it has left us no such points, even to the point now where the laws of logic themselves are no longer being considered to be understood. We are going to use pure reason, get rid of the laws of logic. It never occurred to Kant, of course. But nowadays, people use reason to even question whether logic applies to everyone in the academy. But you've just read Winch or heard extracts from Winch. That's exactly what he's suggesting. There is no, and what that further means is that there's no common human nature. Just tracing implications of this position out. The Azande people are not only have a different language, but they have a different nature that comes with that language. And we are not to judge it because there's no commonality there. This seems to me not and this is my concern, this seems not a basis for a better cooperation and understanding, but a recipe for conflict, because there's no common ground anymore. Common reason, common terms of, like, the scientific world is not the only issue at stake here. It is about what do we have in common. And according to this, it depends on what language you use. So to trace this further down the path, a man by the name of Richard Rorty will talk about interpretative communities which form their own understanding of the world. And there's a logic within that world. And they understand what they mean by this. And they can judge in accordance with that. But there's no categories that outside them that apply to that. So with that, then we can bring in speech codes, which are not oppressive. So I just read that Maria Navratilova, the great tennis player from the 80s that I grew up watching, lesbian, critiqued in Australia. The Australian Open's happening right now, and I don't watch tennis, I'm afraid, anymore. But the Australian National Academy is called the Margaret Court something or other. Another famous tennis player, I guess. I didn't watch her. But she won, I don't know, however many titles, so she's a famous Australian player. So, but she has made comments about the LGBT community, about transgenderism, about the marriage issue and so forth. So she's made politically incorrect statements. And Navratilova and Billie Jean King, another American lesbian tennis player, have said that they ought to change the name of the facility because this is not acceptable. Now, what would lead them to make such an assertion? It's this belief that we have a language community and we can police it and we can draw the boundaries on what's acceptable speech or not. Because that's language. Language is the house of being. And language forms the reality in which we are going to live or not going to live. And it will exclude those who don't want to live within those things. And the we, the royal we here, in this case is Maria Navratilova, who looked up to Margaret Court as a tennis player, apparently. And so she regrets that, but she can't tolerate her use of language. So what began as an inclusive perspective, that is, Winch is suggesting we accept the Azande as, on the terms of understanding that they use, and simply, even though they call it science, and this is the way things are, and we see it as irrational, we have to tolerate them, it then morphs into this. Because that's the way we think. And then again, who's the we? Is there an allowance then for the sort of thing that they tolerate in the Azande? Is that permissible within Western society for differences of opinion amongst its own members? And I think the demonstration there in the case of Navratilova is clearly no, there is not. Or at least that's what they're calling for, and they're doing it quite loudly, and same with John McEnroe, another tennis player. So 3 famous American tennis players saying those Australians need to make an example of Margaret Court and rename the tennis center. According another famous Australian female tennis player, name it after her. Now, in a different age, I would have thought that this was a sort of cultural colonialism. Right? How dare the Americans tell the Australians who they're going to name their tennis center after? But why? But what have they done here? They've assumed that the progressive mindset which we share rules irrespective of nation or culture. In other words, there is no more culture. There's no distinct culture. We're post-nationalist. Right? All of those things. They wouldn't do it to the Chinese. They wouldn't do it to Saudi Arabia. They wouldn't do it to the Iranians. They wouldn't do it to the Africans. Actually, they probably would do it to the Africans. But they wouldn't do it to one of those nations. But they would do it to Australia, which is a sovereign nation, with impunity and not even a blink. They accept or expect that there will be an agreement with it and a shared outrage, and we're going to put pressure on them to make this change. Now, I think it falls into the same sort of contours as this. So language is now the house of being, and language is something that we can change in conformity with our understanding. So what Margaret Court said, which would have been acceptable 20 years ago, is now not acceptable because we don't use language that way. And if we agree that we don't use that language that way, then reality conforms to our use of language. So these people are literally non-being. They're thrown into, is this not a form of dehumanization? I should think so, and worse than what was happening to the Azande. They weren't being called inhuman, they were just being called irrational. And not in themselves, but in the practice. They still were thought to have reason, just the practice was irrational. So all of these things, I don't mean this to be a full-blown critique here of anything, it's just tracing out where these things goes. Shall I come to Gadamer? I'm not going to come to Gadamer. I'll do Gadamer another time. I want to go to a different place with this. And I'm going to backtrack here because I got 5 minutes. And I thought about going to this, and I'm going to go to it now. At this point, when there is the rational criticism and the idea of language as a house of being, and the idea that the Azande language contains a life world in which they operate that we are not, as outsiders, able to criticize, how does that comport with what Augustine said about language? So that's where I'm going to go now. And I want you to just note this. I'm going to read several passages here. This is from De Trinitate, on the Trinity. And I'm going to try and set it up here as best I can. De Trinitate, if you're interested, section 15.4.6. And he is commenting here on Romans 1 verse 20, which is that human beings are able to discern, based on the way things have been made, what the truth is. They know, and therefore they're without excuse, right? Because people know just by living in the world that things are as that God has created and that there is a God, etc., etc. So here's his comment that God's nature is not only there and knowable, but he is supremely better than all the greatness of creation. Here's the quote. It is not, after all, only the authority of the divine books that proclaims that there is a God. Everything around us also, to which we indeed belong, this whole universe of the nature of things, cries out that it has a most excellent founder who also gave us our rational and natural mind, by which we see that living things are to be considered as higher than non-living things, things endowed with sense higher than things not, intelligent things higher than non-intelligent, immortal things higher than mortal ones, powerful things higher than powerless, just things higher than unjust, beautiful things higher than those without beauty, good things higher than bad, incorruptible things higher than corruptible, immutable things higher than mutable, invisible things higher than visible, incorporeal things higher than corporeal, blessed things higher than those that are miserable. And so, since we rank the Creator above created things, we have to admit that he supremely lives and senses and understands all things, and that he cannot die, decay, or change, and that he is not a body, but the most powerful, just and beautiful, the best and happiest spirit of all. Now, the language is what's revealing here. And this is the commentary by Morgan, Edward Morgan, which I find helpful here. Augustine's language is revealing. While there's no doubt that it is reason's activity that judges the relationship between created and uncreated being, the character of reason's activity is something done, first of all, in response to the speech of the world. To the speech of the world. The world speaks in the Heideggerian sense almost. The whole world tells us what its purpose is. It's speaking to us, not in the same exact sense as human speech, but there is a sort of a language of creation, which makes people know that certain things ought not to be done. Reason's affirmations occur because, quote, the whole universe of nature cries out concerning the excellence of the universe's founder. Note the emphasis on the word there. That's the first passage I wanted to read you. Second passage, also on the Trinity and the word-centeredness here of all reality. And this is concerning the Word of God, the second person of the Trinity. He says this, if anyone then can understand how a word can be, not only before it is spoken aloud, but even before the images of its sounds are turned over in thought, this is the word that belongs to no language, and that it is to none of what are called the languages of the nations. He can already see through this mirror and this enigma some likeness of that word, capital W, of which it is said in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So a pre-existent word. If anyone who can conceptualize that, think that thought, will be able to understand how words are incapable of grasping the Word, the living Word, the one who became flesh. So a pre-verbalized human consciousness reveals the inner life of the Trinity, but also in the relationship of Father to Son, or the Father's Word. Now, I'll move on. This is from On the Trinity 15, section 10 and 19 and onwards. The vocal sounds of our speech are signs of the things we are thinking of. So thinking contrary to Heidegger, precedes language. Whereas for Heidegger, language is the house of being. Not for Augustine. What we can think, we have to be able to understand before we can use words. We have to understand prior to the use of the language. Speaking directly back. The vocal sounds of our speech are signs of the things we are thinking of. The word which sounds outside is a sign of the word which lights up inside. Which inner word primarily deserves the name of word?
Sorry.
Okay. For the word that is uttered by the mouth of flesh is the sound of a word, and it is also called word because of the one which assumes it, in order to be manifested outwardly. Thus, in a certain fashion, our inner word becomes a bodily sound by assuming that in which it is manifested to human senses, just as the Word of God, capital W, became flesh by assuming that in which it too could be manifested to human senses. So, going back to this, Augustine's view of language is that thought precedes language, and that it's articulated as such, but the understanding must exist in order for the word to be valid. Otherwise, our words can be nonsensical. They can be contradictory, and cultural distinctions matter not. So this is a significant pushback on Heidegger, and the whole of the linguistic turn is actually what happens when we use words. It's not just conformity to the world, it's conformity to a certain type of understanding which we have in our minds before we even give them words, and sometimes different words. And those will obey the laws of logic, etc. Anyway, that's my response to it. I've run out of time here, and I thought I should at least go there. I had more to read, but I'll leave it off for now.